Hello, and a very warm welcome. I'm Helena Morrissey. I'm afraid I don't have a neat job title. I'm variously described as a city veteran, not sure I like that, a Conservative member of the House of Lords, not doing much better, diversity campaigner, I'll take that one, author, and a board member. And relevant today to mention that I'm also a fellow or governor at Eton College, where I'm a member of its partnership committee, which oversees a hugely ambitious outreach and bursary program. I'm also, since it's relevant to today, I should say, I'm a mother of 9. I'm delighted to be introducing this, the first lecture in the second series of Roger Scruton Memorial Lectures, and to be back here at the wonderful Sheldonian Theatre. It's the first time I've ever been here and not been attending a graduation ceremony. And joyful occasions though they are a little bit repetitive. So I'm very delighted to be here. It's wonderful to see so many people here tonight, and I know we're into a great treat with a fantastic speaker. Roger Scruton's name was very familiar to me even as a young woman. I was a moral sciences undergraduate at the other place, I'm afraid. His seminal works on aesthetics were an important part of the curriculum back then. And very many years later, I had the great honor of meeting him and his lovely wife, Sophie, at a dinner hosted by a mutual friend. It was sadly towards the end of Roger's life. He was, of course, fascinating, very provocative in a wonderful way. There were actually several of us gathered there together that evening who had made a bit of a habit of speaking out of turn, as it were. Not to be difficult, but because challenging flawed conventional wisdom just came naturally to us. It's not the easy road in life. As Sir Roger put it when describing the effects of his editorship of the Salisbury Review, it cost me many thousand hours of unpaid labor, a hideous character assassination in private eye, 3 lawsuits, 2 interrogations, 1 expulsion, the loss of a university career in Britain, unendingly contemptuous reviews, Tory suspicion, and the hatred of decent liberals everywhere. And it was worth it. His words, not mine. So it's wonderful that this annual lecture series is there to commemorate Roger, but it's also been established to protect and cultivate diversity of thought, which is something I've come to appreciate is usually far more welcome in theory than in practice. Listening to informed views that are contrary to our own can deepen our understanding, prevent terrible groupthink mistakes, and rightly challenge our opinions, even make us change our mind on occasions. But sadly, as we all know, cancel culture is real, costing careers, opportunities, friendships, health. And today we are privileged to hear from someone else who challenges conventional thinking, often at considerable personal cost. She is someone I greatly admire for her clarity of purpose, for her vision, her determination, her resilience, and courage. As is widely known, Katharine Birbalsingh first rocketed to public attention after her address to the Conservative Party conference in 2010, when she criticized the British education system, referring to a culture of excuses, of low standards, a sea of bureaucracy, and the chaos of our classrooms. The result, she said, was to keep poor children poor. Her comments, which seemed very reasonable to me, led to her being ostracized by the educational establishment, and she was asked not to return to the school where she taught. Rather than be defeated by the outcry, Katharine used that setback as a springboard for a comeback, establishing and leading the acclaimed, and yes, sometimes controversial, Michaela Academy, a free school in Wembley, which has already transformed the lives of so many children. Last year, she was also appointed chair of the government's Social Mobility Commission. Now, we all know that COVID lockdowns took their toll on so many children, students of this university as well, and their educators in this country. And now the cost of living crisis is creating another huge challenge. There is so much to discuss, and I look forward to returning to the stage after her lecture. But first, I can't wait to hear Katharine share her thoughts on education in 2022. Katharine, thank you. The floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. It's great to see you all. Thank you for coming here. You know, it's funny standing here in the Sheldonian now, remembering what it was like when I was 18. In 1991, over 30 years ago, I started as an undergraduate at New College, just around the corner. I've never been in the Sheldonian before now. I didn't book for my graduation ceremony. Despite finishing my degree, I never chose to come back and graduate. 1991 seems a long time ago now. As a state-educated black girl, it was hard to feel at home here. I used to take the coach to London at weekends when I could, and stand in the middle of Brixton to soak up some normality. And because I felt so distanced from this strange, traditional, and seemingly austere Oxford world, I wasn't happy here. Indeed, when I finished my finals, I packed up my things, rode my bike to the train station, locked it up on the bike racks outside, bought a one-way ticket to London, and did not return. Nowadays, they call me the strictest headmistress in Britain. A bit of a silly title, if you ask me. I think people imagine that I despise children. But I meet with my senior team every morning at 7 a.m. and have spent my entire working life in the inner city with deprived children. The truth is that I love children. That's why I do what I do. Muhammad Ali said, "The man who views the world at 50 the same as he did at 20 has wasted 30 years of his life." 30 years ago, at New College, I was definitely not a small c conservative. So why did I change my mind? My experiences over years of teaching in the inner city made me realize how misguided I'd been. And of course, my parents are from the Caribbean. Like many West Indians, my father is a small c conservative, but very much of the old school left. Small c conservative values are not party political. They are just tried and tested traditional values that work. The old school left is small c conservative, but much of the modern left has abandoned those old small c conservative values. I find the more extreme modern leftists are the ones I am fighting most of the time. So what are we fighting for at Michaela? Our free school opened in 2014 with 120 Year 7s. We are now a full school with over 700 children aged 11 to 18, with a few of them having left us to join you here at Oxford. We want to enable social mobility for our inner city intake, and we want to increase the number of traditional teachers across the country so as to enable social mobility for all. By traditional, I mean the teacher should be the authority in the classroom, leading from the front. These days, that can be quite controversial. Instead of the teacher leading for the last 50 years, child-centered learning has become the thing to do, where the desks are grouped together and young people are told to lead the learning themselves. Then the teacher will move amongst the group desks, helping to keep the children on task, where the teacher is considered to be more of a facilitator of learning rather than a teacher. One often hears teachers say that they learn just as much from their pupils as the pupils learn from them. Well, we at Michaela think that if this is the case, then you can't possibly be a very good teacher. We believe that both parents and teachers shouldn't be friends with the children in their care. Inspire respect and admiration, yes, but not friendship. That is to muddy the lines of respect between child and adult, and to fail to play our roles as adults who should be seen as authority figures in children's lives. Children push, we push back. Children expect us to push back, and when we don't, because we want to be friends with them, or we want them to like us, we let them down. Rob Henderson, a Cambridge PhD student who grew up in care in the United States, who experienced his fair share of chaos growing up, calls this type of thinking luxury beliefs. Luxury beliefs make sense to privileged people, but can often destroy the lives of the less privileged. It's cool and sexy to imagine that kids leading the learning might just work. But in fact, for the vast majority of children who are crying out for order and structure and indeed discipline, schools that are more relaxed can spell total disaster, in particular for the more vulnerable and less privileged child who cannot pay for tutors to make up for the deficits of his school. Discipline. 20 years ago, I didn't have to defend it, but these days I do. Children thrive when we adults understand that children have agency. Doing your homework gets you a merit, but not doing your homework gets you a detention. The child can then choose to do his homework and be rewarded, or not do it and get punished for it. Some people think it's mean to talk about punishing a child these days. In fact, nowadays, the word punishment has disappeared entirely from our schools. In educational circles, after abolishing the word punishment, we began talking instead about sanctions because it sounded nicer. But eventually, the time came when that too was considered too cruel, so we changed it to corrections. Time ticked on when the word corrections also felt too mean, so we transformed it into consequences. At Michaela, we don't feel bad about holding a child to account. We know that to help a child reach for the stars and indeed change his stars, especially one from a more deprived background, one must hold high standards for him. If you let the child off for not doing his homework because you feel guilty, he's poor, or his father isn't around, or he lives on an estate, or he's black, whatever it is, then in the end, when he leaves school functionally illiterate or functionally enumerate, that's on you, because you let your guilt dictate your low standards for the child instead of allowing him to flourish, surrounded by high expectations. True compassion isn't lowering your standards for the poor kids and allowing them to underachieve as a result, and then blaming poverty for their outcomes in order to rationalize your own failures as a teacher or a school leader. Real compassion inspires you to hold the line and empower children of all backgrounds to succeed. Genuine belief in social mobility means believing in the systems and values that will actually enable social mobility, rather than championing ideas that stifle social mobility but make you feel better about your own privilege. You can believe in kids having smartphones, but when deprived kids are up until 3 a.m. on their phones, watching porn and never completing their homework, and then later failing their GCSEs as a direct result, maybe you should review your belief that our culture should encourage children to have smartphones and unsupervised access to the internet. You can believe that silent corridors are oppressive in a school, but when you see schools with challenging intakes where children are terrified to walk in the corridors because of the outbreak of fights, the screaming, the chaos, the bullying, and the terror, you might want to re-examine your belief that silent corridors oppress when they in fact liberate children. You can believe that teachers leading the learning is old-fashioned and boring, but when you read the cognitive science and understand that children learn best when taught explicitly and when directed by the adult, as E.D. Hirsch, an American lifelong Democrat, has argued for his whole life, then you might want to reconsider your ill-judged luxury ideas about what makes for good teaching in the classroom. You can believe that everyone is being well-educated across our school system and hate people like me who try to whistleblow on the modern way of approaching education. But when you look at the national results this year in 2022 and consider that even with all of the inflation on the GCSE exams because of COVID, the advanced information they gave out to help students, again because of COVID, the fact that in order to pass your science GCSE, you only needed to get 19%, that's 19%, and you note that 40% of the country, that's 40%, still managed to fail their science GCSE, you might reassess your view. Indeed, you might find it astonishing that 75% of our exams at Michaela achieved grades 7 to 9, so A's and A stars, while also getting 98% of our kids passes in both English and maths. While GCSE results aren't the only thing that matter, they do matter. When kids leave school without the basics in English, maths, and science, they are not in a position to be socially mobile. Yet our detractors, upon seeing our results, rather than changing their minds about what works, they say things like, sure, you got 98%, but what about the missing 2%? So what do we seek when we say we want to enable social mobility for someone? Do we want them to learn little at school, gain few skills, but then at the end have their grades fixed to match with their private school counterparts? Or better yet, shall we allow them to fail through school and then fulfill a quota requirement for some company under pressure to tick some social mobility boxes? No need to provide them with knowledge and skills. Just tick them into a quota box in some job, and that will do the trick and make us look as if we care about social mobility. Because let's be clear, that's what we're doing when we pursue equality, rather than valuing a more conservative outlook of equality of opportunity. Belief in equality, rather than equality of opportunity, aims for things to look equal in the end, rather than give people the skills that they need so that they can be successful. At Michaela, we prefer to teach a man how to fish, rather than give a man a fish and a lifetime of struggle. But I can see why so many of us prefer to hand over the fish. It makes us feel good about ourselves, about our privilege, and after all, actually teaching a man how to fish is hard and requires daily meetings at 7 a.m. 7 a.m. meetings, or any other types of real action that have real impact, as opposed to just tapping out a tweet or posting a black box on Instagram, are about chasing equality of opportunity, rather than being satisfied with a wholly unjust and patronizing, shoehorned equality that is undeserved. Pursuit of equality of opportunity requires instilling successful habits in children. You learn how to fish by slowly developing these skills and habits over time, through constant repetition, and by persistently and doggedly pursuing high standards with the children. In the end, their habits become who they are. And if these habits, both practical habits and habits of the mind, are the habits of successful people, then the child will succeed. The small C conservative wishes to teach children how to fish so that they can enable social mobility for themselves. Conservatism. These are the Roger Scruton Lectures after all. Sir Roger, a true small C conservative, came to visit Michaela in 2015. I persuaded him to visit by telling him that having him in our school would be tantamount to being graced by Brad Pitt. Sir Roger found my invitation so compelling that he could not resist. I was particularly fond of Sir Roger because when I read philosophy and French while round the corner at New College some 30 years ago, I was very much on the political left, and I had some of Sir Roger's books on my shelves. In those days, I don't think I understood Sir Roger to be a conservative. The only thing I knew of him was that he was incomprehensible. Rather like Immanuel Kant, I would sit and read page after page and find that whatever their politics, I couldn't understand a word. So 2015 was a new beginning for Roger and me. So Roger came to Michaela and spoke to the children about fox hunting. He tried to persuade us of all of its benefits, but I'm not sure he succeeded, judging by the look of horror on the children's faces as he told his stories of red coats, hounds, and bugles. I feel very proud of Sir Roger's visit because I think we helped him see things from a different point of view that day. Here he was in an inner city school filled with ethnic minority children, reciting poetry like Rudyard Kipling's If or William E. Henley's Invictus. Soon after his visit, he gave me a quote for our soon-to-be-published first book, written by our teachers, Battle Hymn of the Tiger Teachers. Here it is. Visiting Michaela was for me a life-changing experience. The triumph of progressive, child-centered education and all the follies associated with it had led me to despair that our inner-city children would ever be able to obtain the knowledge that they need for a successful and socially integrated life. In Michaela, I saw that this despair is entirely unjustified, that good teachers can instill knowledge and discipline into every child, and that a school can be a happy and fruitful home to children of all kinds and of all origins. So you see, it isn't true that conservatives want to get rich and play golf. Of course, it may be true for some conservatives. I mean, I can't speak for them all, but for others, they want the same things as those on the left say that they want. So Roger was led to despair because he thought our inner-city children would not be able to obtain the knowledge they need for a happy life. Small c conservatives, like me, want success and social mobility for deprived children, and indeed, we spend a lifetime fighting for it. But unlike the left, I believe that traditional small c conservative values are what will get us there. Values. Social mobility depends on small c conservative values. At Michaela, we want our children to live worthwhile lives. It is my belief that without small c conservative values, such as personal responsibility, gratitude, sacrifice, service, and valuing that which is sacred, you will struggle to live a life of deeper meaning. In his book, The Righteous Mind, Jonathan Haidt, who is a lifelong Democrat, tries to explain to the left-leaning liberal that conservatives are not evil. They just value different things. As I said earlier, the conservative wants poor children to succeed just as much as the leftist does. They just think a different path will get us there. Haidt explains that the leftist tends to see things through the lens of fairness. So when we at Michaela push personal responsibility and say that when a child hasn't done his homework, he is responsible for himself and should have done it, the leftist thinks that this is unfair. Some children have harder lives. So the poor kid who doesn't have a quiet place at home to do his work and whose younger siblings are constantly interrupting him should not be held to account. He does not deserve the detention. It is unfair. But we small c conservatives never said that life was unfair. Although spending a lifetime not being able to read or write because your teacher thought that it was mean to give you a detention seems pretty unfair to me. Conservatives don't see everything through the lens of fairness, and we believe other values matter in life, like taking personal responsibility, or like sacrificing, or being grateful for what you have, no matter how little that is, rather than wallowing in a state of debilitating victimhood, or like loving your country, even though it is flawed, because it means you belong to it, and you and your countrymen can help to make it better. Anyone who has ever overcome any obstacle in life knows that if you spend all your energy agonizing about how insurmountable or unfair that obstacle is, you'll never overcome it. Not only are you consumed with anger over how unfair the world has been to you, you might even find yourself using it as an excuse to explain a number of your own failings instead of addressing those failings. One strand of white privilege is not having racism readily available as an explanation, so you are forced to learn from your mistakes. You aren't encouraged by the media and societal culture to see yourself as a victim. Embracing personal responsibility is the only way you can succeed in life, whoever you are. Social mobility cannot exist without it. An ethnic minority child can succeed despite racism. A poor child can succeed despite not having been to Eton. I have taught many children of all backgrounds in my time who don't know where Paris is, have no idea that there were 2 world wars, and do not know the words to our national anthem. People have no idea how little some children know. The teaching of basic cultural knowledge can be even worse with minority children because the thinking is that ethnic minority children cannot identify with so-called white things. White teachers feel uncomfortable having ethnic minority children sing the national anthem. But who loses out? The child who was taught over and over by his school, by the media, by us all, that he does not belong to his own country. How is any child meant to succeed in a country that he does not view as his own? At Michaela, we sing God Save the King. In fact, it's a bit weird these days getting used to the change and coming to terms with the fact that our little Year 7s never had the chance to sing God Save the Queen. That will always make me a little bit sad. And while the Twitterati were up in arms over the fact that we teachers at Michaela all wore black when the Queen died and pulled our flag to half-mast, for us, it was perfectly obvious that this was the right thing to do. For many of the Twitterati, they were shocked that we had a British flag at all. How can we call ourselves British when so many of us have our origins from somewhere else? Because we're as British as any white person, that's why. And this determination of the progressives to deny ethnic minorities their birthright to identify as British is outrageous. But no one seems to notice. Kids are kids. It doesn't matter what race or religion they are. We're all human underneath. And human beings need to feel as if they belong to their family, to their school, to their community, and to their country. If they do not belong there, they will find belonging in a gang or in a worrying social media group where the child will be ripe for radicalization. This pernicious identity politics way of viewing people poisons not just our culture in schools, but the content of what we teach too. The march is on in our schools to decolonize as much as possible. I have a poem in my office by Maya Angelou called The Caged Bird. The caged bird sings with a fearful trill of things unknown but longed for still, and his tune is heard on the distant hill, for the caged bird sings of freedom. Preventing poor kids from accessing British cultural knowledge, like knowledge of Britain's history, our great works of literature, of knowledge of our habits and customs, is to shut them in a cage. I'll tell you what sets a child free. Being able to read, being numerate, knowing where Paris is, and knowing enough science so that you can scrape 19% on your science GCSE. That doesn't mean you don't tell them about the million Indian soldiers or the hundreds of thousands of Caribbean soldiers who fought for Britain during the Second World War. Nor does it mean you won't tell them that black people have been in Britain since Roman times and that John Blank, Henry VIII's trumpeter, was black. But it should not mean that we end up spending so much time on black tutors that Elizabeth barely gets a look in, and kids end up leaving school with the misconception that loads of people in Tudor England were black. While it was wrong to whitewash ethnic minorities out of British history, as used to be the case, it is equally wrong to talk about black history as if it is some kind of add-on. British history simply involves a variety of different people, and they should all be included in its teaching, which should be chronological. That is how history was once traditionally taught. Not jumping around from topic to topic like Jack the Ripper because it's gory and will engage, and Titanic because there is a popular film with a younger and sexier Leonardo DiCaprio. People rail against dead white men because they're white men, and it's seen as unfair that they get taught over mainly 20th century authors, some of whom may be female and black. At Michaela, while we do teach black authors like Andrea Levy's Small Island, also took them to see the brilliant play at the National last year, or Toni Morrison's Beloved, amongst others, we are not decolonizing. We are proud of the fact that our children will read, and read well, 4 Shakespeare plays. They will learn Romeo and Juliet's prologue by heart, and they will shout out Caesar's speech of courage. Cowards die many times before their deaths. The valiant never taste of death but once. Maya Angelou said, when she first read Shakespeare, she was convinced he had to be a black woman because he so understood her plight as a black woman. Shakespeare is universal and speaks to the human condition. And while identity politics tries hard to make us think that we have to send a black woman to the moon to represent black women, the fact of the matter is that we are all human, And Neil Armstrong did the job of representing me in 1969. An ethnic minority child can access Shakespeare just as well as any white child can. Why should we teach Shakespeare? Because he's been influencing literature for over 400 years. There would be no Maya Angelou without Shakespeare. We are all so wrapped up with identity politics that when we talk of Dickens or Shakespeare or Larkin or Keats, all we hear is white men. But what makes them important is not the fact that they are white or men, but the fact that they are dead. And having been dead for such a long time, they've had huge impact on the world of literature. I'm an author. I'm a black author. I do not believe that schools should be teaching my books over Shakespeare. But if the day ever comes when I have been influencing literature for over 400 years, then please do, by all means, teach my books instead of his. We began our Michaela journey in early 2011. It took us 3.5 years to open finally in September 2014. You might ask, what took us so long? Our leftist detractors hated us and did a great job for a long time stopping us from opening. Sadly, they did the same to a number of free schools and succeeded in stopping them. You might ask why anyone would want to prevent a new school for deprived inner-city kids. We tried to set up in 3 different parts of London, and in each of those 3 places, we put everything we had into it, marching up and down rainy streets, handing out flyers, visiting community centers, churches, mosques, gathering parents together for parent evenings, hiring bouncers to deal with the threats coming from the protesters, standing up in front of a potential parent audience you knew had been infiltrated by detractors who at any moment would stand up to disrupt and start shouting abuse. Once, a white middle-class woman jumped up at one of our information events, pointing her finger at me. "You betrayed us," she shouted. I firmly believe that this sense of betrayal comes from the fact that I, as a black woman, should be grateful to the left. They own me and they own my thoughts. And when I spoke at the Conservative Party in 2010, I betrayed my masters. Those 3.5 years setting up were tough. Once we had opened, detractors would still protest with signs outside. They even broke onto our school site at night. They would hand out flyers to our Year 7s saying that the building was a health and safety hazard and that we were endangering them. Death threats have been sent to the school. The intensity of hatred has been so immense that one of my office staff had a breakdown. Anything our detractors could get their hands on, they would throw to the press in order to cause controversy. The same happens to this day. People aren't interested in a discussion or in hearing an alternative point of view. Recently, Jordan Peterson visited our school, walked around the corridors, and had lunch with the kids. Weeks after the visit, I had to speak to someone from the council after Ofsted passed them dozens of complaints. The council explained that they had spoken to their people at Prevent, the people meant to prevent terrorism, and their people in Safeguarding, about the fact that I had Jordan Peterson in my school because I had tweeted a photo about it, so people knew. A renowned professor and psychologist. Their investigation included asking me a series of questions. I dutifully answered, but it sent a chill down my spine. Jordan Peterson did what 600 other people do every year. They visit our school. You are all welcome to come visit our school as well. You can think whatever you like, and you can still come to see our school. All you have to do is sign up on the website. Why do we want you all to visit? Because if you see the school, it's hard to argue against it. When you meet our kids and see how polite, determined, considerate, and decent they are, like Roger Scruton, you begin to think that if we teach them properly, deprived kids have a chance at a happy life. It is why we finally allowed a production company to do a documentary at Michaela. It was aired in May on ITV, called Britain's Strictest Headmistress. Unlike a book, through a documentary, you can get to know the children and see and feel what success looks like. Some of my staff have pleaded with me over the years, please, Katharine, please, can we just keep quiet about our small c conservative values? Sure, we could, but then I'd be hiding the key to a successful school. Small c conservative values address a deeper understanding of human nature and are crucial in encouraging a child to be the best version of himself. Which brings me to grammar schools. Peter Hitchens, the well-loved and shockingly conservative journalist, and I have argued about this for years. Incidentally, Hitchens doesn't like the Conservative Party precisely because he feels they have lost their small c conservative values. Some years ago, Peter Hitchens visited Michaela and announced that I was his opponent because I had taken the bone of free schools that the Conservative Party had thrown us, and I had therefore undermined the real fight, the only fight that matters, the fight to have more grammar schools. My conversations with Peter Hitchens have moved me quite a bit on the grammar school front. I used to be vehemently against them. These days, my understanding of the grammar school debate is far more nuanced. That's what happens when you talk to people you disagree with. You develop your thinking. The same, I would say, happened to Peter. He first came to our school to denounce us. We were talking in my office, and I was desperately defending what we do. And at one point, he suddenly stood up and said he was leaving. And I could see he wasn't impressed. I demanded he should stay. He went to go, and so I grabbed his scarf off him, making it clear he'd have to fight with me to get it back. And I ordered him to sit down. To my surprise, he did. Perhaps that act alone of managing to tame Peter Hitchens should allow me the title of Britain's strictest headmistress. In the end, Peter spent half the day with us, looking at our curriculum, visiting lessons, eating lunch with the children, looking at children's work, etc. It was worse than an Ofsted inspection. There are 2 grammar schools near Michaela in Barnet. Our top kids took the 11 plus and didn't get in. The abolition of grammar schools in the 1960s was a great travesty for our country. It allowed progressivism to infiltrate education over decades and eventually dominate all of our schools, including our current grammar and private schools. Unless you actively resist it, no school is free from progressivism. It's in the water now. The most egregious attack on our schools happened when, as a result of the disappearance of our grammars, we scrapped the O-level and CSE exams and replaced them with the GCSE exam. This was a direct assault on standards, and they have been dropping ever since. Michael Gove restored some of that lost integrity to our exam system in 2015, but the demise had been going on for too long, and there was only so much he could do. Have a look at the O-level papers from 1970 if you don't believe me. Critics will say that only 20% of the country sat O-levels. Indeed, that 20% are no longer being stretched to the old O-level standard. And for the country, that's a terrible thing. If we are pursuing equality, then yes, we can make it so that all of us know equally little. But for the small c conservative, it is a good thing that the most able in the country know more. Having said all that, do I believe we should be concentrating on trying to revive grammar schools now? No. Why? Because we are where we are, and grammar schools distract from the fight against progressivism that is needed in 2022. The fight began years ago with Michael Gove and Nick Gibb, and it has since stalled. Opening up a handful of grammar schools is tantamount to rearranging the deck chairs as the Titanic goes down. Since the Gove and Gibb education reforms, which helped to start the UK educational revolution on the ground, the Conservative Party has not pushed through with the next steps in trying to encourage schools to teach more traditional knowledge, as I spoke of earlier, with high levels of discipline. Dare I say, the Conservative Party might embrace small c conservative values? Could the Conservative Party perhaps try to be conservative? Or, if Labour take over, which seems likely these days, then perhaps they could rediscover their small c conservative values. We need to promote small c conservative values in education and highlight where such values are a recipe for success, in particular for the most disadvantaged. Progressivism moves like a panther in the night, gripping the heart of our education system, and yet we're chatting about opening what won't amount to more than a dozen grammar schools, which will promote progressive teaching. It's foolish to think we'll build the grammar schools of yesteryear. Sadly, those traditional teachers and traditional curricula are long gone. The left thinks grammar schools or private schools are unfair because lots of children don't get in. Hitchens would point out that the left are hypocrites because while they hate selection by ability, they embrace selection by wealth. They turn a blind eye to families who move into catchment areas, or worse, briefly rent a flat nearby in order to get a place at an outstanding state school. This is why, at Michaela, we use the lottery admission system, not distance, so families cannot rig the system in their favor. Hitchens prefers grammars because they are transparent about their selection. Of course, I think that the children who failed to get into our local grammars, but instead came to Michaela, are really rather lucky. It is ingrained in us that grammar or private schools are better, but that isn't necessarily true. How do you actually know that grammar or private schools are better? Have you seen their lessons? Have you studied the homework set? How do you know? Or do they just look better? My issue with grammars now is that they are a proxy in the way that black boxes on Instagram are. They make us feel as if something is being done, when the truth is, what needs doing is far more complex and far harder than you could possibly imagine. Black boxes on Instagram allow the owner to feel as if they're anti-racist, when in reality, the act is meaningless and serves only to make things look a certain way. Opening a dozen progressive grammar schools won't have much impact on social mobility. Working-class children only make up 3% of the intake of grammars, and they won't improve education overall because they'll simply prop up the belief in modern progressive education. Their kids will do well on their GCSEs because they're extremely able, and we will be fooled into further embracing progressivism for all. But we won't understand that those kids do well in spite of their schooling, not because of it. One cannot hold highly selective schools to account with the current exam system. The standards of the old O-level are gone. This grammar school discussion distracts from what really needs to be done to improve our schools, but it could make the government look as if something is being done. Having said that, I think that Peter Hitchens and Sir Roger Scruton would probably say that schools aren't meant to promote social mobility. Where they do, it is something to celebrate, but that is not their core purpose. I suspect they would say that schools are meant to educate the populace, and that whatever system is most efficient at doing this should be the one to have. Whether it is fair to everyone is irrelevant. Yes, Hitchens and Scruton would accept my left-leaning criticisms of the 11+ these days. In the day, it genuinely tested for innate ability and allowed a number of working-class children entrance. But these days, because of the enormous industry that has sprung up for the preparation for the 11+, the grammars inevitably miss out on many working-class children who will have innate ability, but have not been prepared for the exams. If you want to get your child into a grammar or private school, tutoring for a few months is not enough. People get tutors and tutoring classes twice a week for years in the run-up to the 11+. How can a kid whose parents neither have the means nor the awareness of what is required from age 7 compete with that? The idea that grammar schools give ordinary working families a leg up is a nonsense. But I suspect Scruton and Hitchens would say it doesn't matter. The future of our country is what matters, and given that so many teachers don't want to embrace traditionalism, then they despair and feel that grammars are their only option. But they are presuming, wrongly in my view, that simply calling a school a grammar school and putting bright kids in it will resurrect the standards and traditionalism of decades gone. Where will they get the teachers, the resources, the mindset, and the ambition? Will they return to 1950 in a time machine to find them? It isn't the grammar schools that produce tradition. It was tradition that produced our grammar schools. Their love of grammar schools and educating the brightest means they have given up on the fight for tradition and a better education for all. And I don't want to give up on that fight. Peter Hitchens told me at the end of his first visit to Michaela that we were a fire burning underwater. By the end of his visit, we had won his approval. But in true Hitchens, the end is nigh style, he said that eventually we would lose the fight and that our little fire would be extinguished. Ever since, I've been fighting tooth and nail to keep the water out. And while we are surviving, I do sometimes wonder whether Peter might be right, that our enemies and our increasingly worrying and encroaching modern culture will win. I so want to prove Peter Hitchens wrong. But I would venture to say that Peter Hitchens and I are friends. Since his first visit to Michaela years ago, he has returned a few times. I had lunch today with his wife. She's here in the audience with her friends. Muhammad Ali is correct in his view that a man who thinks as he did at 20 when he is 50 has wasted 30 years of his life. Cancel culture and the way in which so many people refuse to engage with those who disagree with them is most disheartening. I came here today to try to persuade you to think differently from those who fill the airwaves, from those who insist that discipline, adults in authority, gratitude, sacrifice, rejection of victimhood, stoicism, duty towards others are old-fashioned, conservative, and without flair. I don't want my kids to feel as I did at university, lost and out of place, where I didn't belong. You'll be pleased to know that when I got out at the train station today, my bike was no longer locked up on the bike racks outside. I want our young people to feel perfectly at ease with all the same cultural capital of the Boris Johnsons and David Camerons of this world, in whatever field or industry they end up in. As Sir Roger saw when he visited Michaela, it is possible for deprived kids, whether they are ethnic minority, from the inner city, white from the north, from a coastal town, or any number of things, to surmount their disadvantage. But that's only possible if we stop trying to compensate for that disadvantage. Instead, we must help them overcome it. The thing about truth is that it is rarely simple, often hidden, and difficult to understand. What is especially hard to navigate is that too many people promote ideas that sound good, but are not true. I will leave you with a quote that I have on my office wall from Thomas Sowell, an African-American social theorist and economist. His words of wisdom will help you figure out whether someone is genuine in their pursuit of justice. When you want to help people, you tell them the truth. When you want to help yourself, you tell them what they want to hear. My advice to you over the next 30 years, so that you may live a fruitful life, is this. Look beneath the surface. Look beyond the black box on Instagram. Seek out the truth and have the courage to take the road less traveled by. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Katharine, for such a stimulating talk that puts a lot of things in perspective when we have to discuss these matters of education, kindness, transmission, all these words that seem to work as buzzwords lately, but we don't really know how to engage with them in a constructive way. So when I visited Michaela in June, one of my dearest memories that remained with me is discussing loyalty in Romeo and Juliet and Julius Caesar with 13-year-olds. That's the sort of conversations that they have over lunch. Yet the most interesting memory that stuck with me was that one of the pupils, upon learning that I was teaching French, told me, well, I have my exam in a few days. What can I do to have good results? That was mind-blowing. For pupils in Michaela, the teacher really has this responsibility of teaching. I think we're victims of two very dreadful ideas lately that are, sadly enough, due to French thinkers. The first one is linked to Jean-Paul Sartre's theory that any form of revolution is good. Whenever you can break something, if you can break it, just go ahead and break it, because it will be all right anyway. The other idea that comes from Sartre's great-great-great-grandfather intellectually is Jean-Jacques Rousseau's idea that humans are inherently good, that we are born with an inner sense of knowledge and we can figure things out on our own. Sadly enough, you can't expect someone to figure out French on his or her own. It's a bit more complicated than that, and that's where the duty of the grown-up comes in. The trouble when your teacher is your friend, your father is your friend, your mother is your friend, any figure of authority around you is your friend, is that you end up having no teacher, no father, no mother. A child who's only surrounded by adults who want to see themselves as being kind is a forsaken child. What Katharine's lecture reminded us of today is this responsibility that the older generations have towards the younger, that we cannot just lay back and tell ourselves, well, I have been good to this child because I haven't told him or I haven't told her that the grammar in this sentence is dreadful. Well, no, there is a moment when we need a wake-up call and to say, well, no, this sentence makes no sense. You have to rewrite it. Here is a way to make it better. So perhaps following on this conversation, we could ask ourselves, haven't we all become the friend who doesn't tell others that there's a bit of salad in their teeth? Haven't we all become the fake kind friend? And if so, is there any way we can, well, give a push to the grown-ups in the room to be proper grown-ups? If Helena or Katharine would like to come back on that.
Well, Katharine might want to respond first because perhaps she didn't, well, I think you did specify some of that, but are we all the adult that won't tell the other one about the salad in the teeth at this point? Because you talked about children and adults, and are we in danger of not really challenging each other as well? Or
yes, well, I think the Thomas Sowell quote at the end really does say it all. Unfortunately, the truth doesn't necessarily work for the individual who's telling it, so then we tend to shy away from telling the truth. And those of us who try and tell the truth get attacked for it. So much easier just to sort of stay quiet about it and not say anything. But I think we all have to be brave. You know, and it doesn't mean you have to go and set up a school. You can just be brave with the people around you and say what you think. And I do understand that in this day and age, it's really very hard to do that because people get cancelled, people can be put in difficult positions, so you have to be careful. But I mean, I remember once meeting this woman at a party, and she said she had a 9-10-year-old, her eldest was 9 or 10. She said she and her husband were moving out of London soon because, of course, they were coming up to secondary school age. And I said, gosh, that seems, she said she didn't want to move and she loved being in London. And I said, oh, well, you know, what about private school? I mean, might that be an option? And she said, oh, no, we couldn't send our children to private school. We'd lose all our friends. And I mean, it was ridiculous that was her, and that is unfortunately how people do things, which is they think, well, what do I look like? What does it feel like? As opposed to what is real? What's true? And yeah, if it was only about salad, I wish it was only about salad, but unfortunately it's about a lot more than that.
Can I ask you one question? Because I loved your lecture, and obviously all the things I said in my introduction, you know, we have to double it all. And obviously the courage that you have had to fight the fight, as you put it, to take the road less traveled, you know, as it comes to immensity and your passion. But one thing that I guess, you know, you spent time, particularly at the beginning of your talk, talking about, and I think this is very sort of pivotal to your philosophy around education, the adults be the adults and the children be the children. But your students are with you from like 11 to 18, and by the time they leave, they've got to be young adults at Oxford or wherever they go. So at what point, because I watched the documentary, I recommend it to anybody who hasn't seen it, by the way. It's really, if you can't go to see the school, this is the next best thing. It's really great. And you see so much of how the school ticks. But I did feel, what I didn't get was what happens, at what stage did the children become like young adults in terms of, you know, because you have a lot of clapping. There's a lot of 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, sit, or slant, or see, I watched it closely. And yet you can't get an 18-year-old to do that. That's not gonna.
No, so at the sixth form is a little different. You know, they're not in the lunch. They go out for lunch if they want. They eat in the common room. You know, they're not walking in single file in the corridors like the other children are and so on. And so it's different. But even throughout the lower school, you know, the little year 7s were always saying, straight arms, you know. With the year 11s, I mean, you would never be able to get the year 11s doing this. I mean, they're a lot more relaxed. So obviously things change as they get older. But I think what's important, what you're saying there is interesting, and people often ask this. It's like, as if there's a point. At what point do they then become something else? It's the wrong way to look at it. When you think about those of you who've had children, and you wanted your child to learn to cross the street, there wasn't a point where you suddenly went, now you're a young adult, so you can cross the street on your own. What happened was, you regularly took them to cross the street by holding their hand over and over and over again. And eventually, when you knew that they could do that particular thing, you let them cross the street on their own. Now, it may be that years before that, they were able to pour a drink on their own. And years before that, they were able to go to the toilet on their own. There are different stages at which you then go, okay, you can do this. So in everything that a child learns how to do, you scaffold them, then you take the scaffolding away. And then you scaffold here and scaffold there, and then you take the scaffolding away. Until eventually, they get to a point when they're about 18 or so, where you set the bird off and it can fly on its own. But that's because over years, you have been developing in them various habits so that they can cross the street and they can pour a drink and they can say hello. When you're teaching a child how to say please or thank you, you give them the chocolate and they go to grab it, don't they? And you say, what do we say? And before that, you'll have said, please, and they say, please. And the next time, they repeat, please, please, until eventually you're going, pa, 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 and they go, please. You say, well done, here's the chocolate. And eventually, then you could say, and what do we say? And you don't give, so that's scaffolding. You give the whole word, then you give them the p, then you say, what do we say? Until eventually, the please comes out naturally. Every single one of us in this room went through that, which is why when you ask me for something, we'll say please, we'll say thank you. You don't have to, when this happens, think to yourself, must remember to say please, must remember to say please, must remember to say thank you. You know, we don't have to say that. And all of us think, well, that's silly. Of course we don't have to say that. It's not silly. I can tell you from my many years of teaching that many children struggle with knowing how to say please and thank you. It's not part of their habitual way of being. They don't know how to sit up straight. We take for granted that we're able to sit up straight, look at each other in the eye, and talk. If you do not teach that to children, and if they're not in the habit of doing that regularly, those of you who have visited the school, and if you come, you will see how the children at lunch sit there, and they serve food to each other, and we give a topic of conversation, and they learn how to eat their food, and talk at the same time, and look at each other. These are things, if you are not learning in your family home, if you don't learn it at school, you will never learn it. And then that means that all of these skills are what's going to make you socially mobile. And if we then say, no, just let him go free, this is not true freedom. Freedom comes from self-control. And if you don't have any self-control, any self-discipline, any ability to sit on a chair, look at somebody, talk to them, this stuff has to be trained. And then eventually they do it on their own. So little year 7s, we call it slanting. They have to slant, hands straight, arm straight, and they're all going miss, 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 miss. And then by the time they get in year 11, they're a little bit more relaxed. They're a bit more kind of like this. And when they go through the corridors, so the little year 7s go through the corridors going, morning, miss, and the year 11s kind of walk along, morning, miss. And they knock the chin up, in this cool way. Yeah, I'm saying hello. But the fact is, they're saying hello, and they are polite. They do it in their cool 15-year-old way, but they're able to do it because it's part of who they are. If you never teach them to go, morning, miss, they'll never get there. And then when they go for the job interview, when they go for the university interview and so on, they have no idea how to behave. And these are habits that the middle classes take for granted, that they instill in their own children, and then they say, don't worry about the working classes, leave them to it. And the fact is, of course, there are many working class children where that will also happen in the home. But for some of them who really are quite disadvantaged, they don't necessarily get that at home, so it is for the school to try and do that for them.
I did have another question, which was a kind of a bigger one, actually. So let's unleash Katharine on this one. So towards the end, you sounded a little bit, not pessimistic, but you talked about the fire being extinguished by the water. You've done an amazing amount in terms of just spreading the word, as well as obviously running Michaela School. But do you think of collaborating with other schools or obviously you work with government, you're on the Social Mobility Commission, but one way to expand your reach and your message would be to collaborate. I've seen that work in lots of other situations.
Yeah, those 600 people who come, most of them are teachers. Okay. And many of these ideas are happening in schools and in classrooms all over, thanks to being able to see schools like ours at work. So while I give talks like this, and this is great, you need to be able to see it at work in the school. And my teachers will give little mini conferences at the school and give advice. I will go and talk to various teachers. In schools, I do all kinds of conferences where I speak, but also they get to come to the school, they get to look at our lessons, they get to see what's possible. Sometimes I have teachers who visit the school from elsewhere, and they will actually start to cry. They genuinely, tears fall, because they can't believe what they're seeing, because the kids in their schools would never behave like this. A friend of mine who works at one of our local schools, who's been there for 20-something years, he came to visit us and went round the school, and then at one point he came bursting into my office, and he said, Katharine, I've been asking the kids where they've all been to primary school, and they've all been to the same primary schools as our kids. What have you done to them? I mean, he just couldn't believe that they were just normal inner city kids. It just didn't make any sense. And the more we do it and the longer we do it, the more difficult it becomes to criticize us. And the more people who are sitting on the fence in teaching come round to what we do. And that happens to me all the time. I'm walking down the street, somebody comes up to me and says, I used to think you were a lunatic, but now, actually, I've been following you on Twitter for 2 years, and you've persuaded me, So people do, and I often believe, while I can get a lot of hate on Twitter, that there are a whole load of people who are just silent. They're not saying anything, and they're quietly watching, and they're quietly changing their minds about things. So that gives me a lot of hope. But it's true that it's a fight. It is a constant fight to try and to keep the water out, And it's because it's so much about culture, Culture is, this is why the small c conservative values matter. You need a culture which is small c conservative, that the children are then just immersed in. So it's human nature to want to seek victimhood and say, it's not my fault, it's because I'm a victim. That's the case for all of us. It's human nature to want to take the easier road. You don't want to go to the gym, you don't want to eat the broccoli, you want to eat the chocolate. All of us are in the same position. But if you can immerse the children in a different sort of culture, it makes them resilient. So what teachers are often amazed by is just how ambitious and resilient our kids are. It is also the case that they are, really well taught and really knowledgeable. And while I'm very proud of our GCSE results, I am, and they matter, as I said in my talk, but the thing I'm most proud about is what our kids are like. They're so lovely, they're so kind and decent to each other. I always refer, for instance, to our dining hall. In dining halls, in many schools, if a plate drops, a kid trips or a plate drops, the kids in the school will all start howling and doing, "Boo!" That's what they do. At our school, if a kid drops his food, several kids will run. They will pick the food up with their fingers, lasagna on the ground, and they're picking it up with their fingers to put it back in the plate. It's unbelievable. And I look at this and just think, often I look and I think, this is just extraordinary. And it's because of the culture of gratitude and kindness and decency that we've got. And that only comes with a small c conservative culture, I would say.
Absolutely. Well, another thing that is quite striking is that the children at Michaela believe that school will get them somewhere. They believe that if they work hard and have good grades, they will have a better life. That's something that children from my generation used to believe, but when I was teaching in high school, most of the kids wanted to be YouTubers or influencers. And just seeing a 13-year-old who has a professional project, who knows, well, I want to do this, I will work hard to do this, and everything around me is meant to help me doing that, from leaving my mobile phone in the storage with the locker. It's just amazing how happy they are to let go of technology because they know that they have better chances to do well at their exam if there is no mobile phone around. I wish I could do that, just set the mobile phone aside and focus on what really matters. But it's also the teachers, the whole community seems to transmit this idea that their education is important, that it's the most important thing they can do then. So how do you create that? Let's say for a child coming from another school with a completely different mindset, how do you instill this idea that your schooling matters and this is what is going to change your life?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. You have to be narrating it all the time. So I give 7 assemblies every week. That's for our 7-year groups. And I never miss assembly, ever. This morning, I gave that's what happens. Everything is around. There are all sorts of pulls on my time. We know that I don't miss assembly. Then they also have an assembly with their head of year once a week. Then they get, so all of these values are narrated in assembly. But not only that, their head of year sees them at the beginning of the day and line up outside. Then the head of year speaks to them again briefly at break time. Then their head of year speaks to them again at lunch. So every day, 3 or 4 times in the day, these values are being narrated. Then their form tutor, when they're in form time, again, will be narrating these kinds of values. So my job as head is very much to bring consistency across the school so that we're all singing from the same hymn sheet. And we know what we believe in. If you spoke to any one of my teachers, any one of them, you would hear something very similar to what I'm saying to you now. And I think that we misunderstand what schools should be like. So when I say about the Twitterati being up in arms about us all wearing black, it was the fact that all of us were wearing black, because they were saying, well, they shouldn't all be wearing black, they should be able to do whatever they want to do, da, 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 da. And then I think, well, when you go into the Apple store, you don't have some people selling you Microsoft and some people selling you Apple. It would be insane. Obviously, everybody promotes Apple. So when you come to Michaela, we all sing God Save the Queen, and we all get God Save the King, and we all get that that's what we do. That's what we're about. And the thing is, is that not all my staff are, I mean, I have one member of my staff, he says he's an outright Marxist. That's what he calls himself. And he's very much an anti-royal family. But he gets that this is what the school is about. And that is what he delivers to the kids. And he would never do otherwise, because he would never betray the school or betray me and be disloyal in that way to what we believe in. He believes in the school and what we are doing for the children. And it's the same, I mean, I don't know, maybe some of the guys who work at Apple on the shop floor use Microsoft privately at home, but they certainly don't talk about it when they're at work. You know, like, and we don't seem to get it when it comes to schools. We all need to be singing from the same hymn sheet. We all need, and so the kids are then surrounded by consistency. Children love predictability. They understand order and structure. What people don't get is that we want them to be creative and to think for themselves. The only way a child feels secure enough to think for himself is when he is surrounded by predictability and order. That's when he has the courage to push the boat out. When he is surrounded by chaos, you are not going to get creativity in that situation. It's the same way that freedom comes from self-control. It's not, intuitively, it doesn't seem to make sense. But the way in which children explore, our kids, I mean, our kids are inner city kids. When we, you know, you have all these elections happening all the time, so we have these mock elections, and the last one, it was fascinating. Some of them voted Labour, some of them voted Conservative. We even had some of them voting UKIP. Now, this is an inner city school. And then you think, how is this happening? But we just got up and on, you know, at assemblies, and we showed them what the different parties all stood for, and with the economy, with immigration, with education, and so on. And then they made up their own minds. And they sit on those lunch tables, and they're given a topic to talk about, and they argue with each other. And they have different ideas. That's where you get creativity and thinking for yourself. My point about knowledge, because in education, everybody thinks if you're just giving them knowledge, then you're not getting them to think for themselves. You cannot be creative about something if you don't know anything about it. You have to give them lots of knowledge. I say about myself, if you ask me to be creative with astronomy or with cars, I can't be creative with cars. I don't know anything about them. But I'll tell you where I'm creative. It's with education. I'll tell you where I'm thinking outside the box. It's with education. I'll tell you where I'm different. It's with education. You know why? Because I know it inside out. The only way you can be creative is if you know something really well. And it is for our jobs as adults in their lives, as teachers and as parents, we have to tell them what the stuff is. Instead, this is what happens. In schools, what happens is you stand in front of the class and you say, who knows where Michaela is? A few kids put up their hands. Wimbledon? No, a little bit further north. Westminster? No, a bit more further. Camden? Come on, begins with a W. Oh, Wembley? Yeah, isn't that great? Why not just tell them Michaela's in Wembley? Takes you 2 seconds, right? Takes you 2 seconds. And the thing is, we're all laughing like this is like some kind of, I'm telling you some weird story. I'm telling you this is happening in classrooms every day, all the time. This is how teaching is. They think that teaching is cheating. That's what they think. They think that teaching is cheating, that somehow you've cheated by just telling them the answer. No, you're teaching. That's what it is to teach. And the thing is, 50 years ago, what I'm saying right now, it was just normal. It was commonplace for everybody to understand that you've got to tell them stuff, right? Nowadays, honestly, what I'm saying, I mean, it's radical. It's radical. And the thing is that when you start teaching them properly, you see what happens, as you'll see me say in the documentary, what happens is that little Amy in the front, who's always at home reading books with her parents and always gets taken to museums and on interesting holidays because she comes from a middle-class family, you ask a question, and Amy goes, maybe yes. And Amy gets the answer right. And then you ask another question, and Amy goes, maybe yes. And Amy gets the question right. You haven't taught the answers because Amy just knows this stuff because she's at home learning this stuff from her parents. And little Johnny at the back thinks, how come Amy's always getting these questions right? I must be dumb. What Johnny doesn't think is, oh, I must be from a different socioeconomic background. He doesn't think that. He thinks he's dumb. And in order to regain some self-confidence and some pride, He starts whacking David. He starts whacking John. And then eventually, you've got to send Johnny out. And over time, Johnny's out and out and out, and then we label him with some special needs label, and then he needs to have special help. And when he leaves school functionally enumerate and functionally illiterate, we say that it was because he was poor. It is not because he was poor. The poor kids in Africa, the poor kids in the Caribbean, and in India, and in China are all learning this stuff, and they are far poorer than our kids. The reason why Johnny didn't learn is because there was chaos in his classroom, and because the teacher felt like she had to not teach him because that would be cheating. All she had to do was tell him the answer, tell them all the answer, so that they should all have equal chance of being able to get the right answer. But we don't do it because for the last 50 years, our Western education system and our understanding of what kids can do has completely changed. And so in the end, like Michaela, the woman we named the school after, she was from St. Lucia, old school, believed in discipline, believed in rigor. She always used to say to me, Katharine, where is the rigor? And she was so great. She died in 2011 of cancer. And what is so terrible is that teachers like her are literally dying out. They're literally or they're retiring. And then we've got new teachers. And of course, I'm trying to convince the new teachers, you know, and some of us, I'm not the only one. There are other ones like us, like me, but we are in the minority. And that is why it sometimes feels as if the water is pouring in, because there's so few of us. And all of us in this room need to fight. You need to talk to people, you know. I mean, that's one thing, but everybody here, I mean, I was talking to all of you as if you were 20 years old, but everybody here is older than 20. But what I wanted to say, because I need to get this in, which is that anybody who's interested in a job, anybody who's interested in teaching, we are always advertising, always looking. Some of you who are older might have young, you know, children, nieces, nephews. Tell them to get in touch with me. I have jobs in the office, jobs, you know, people who have a gap year. They want to do a gap year in the office. Please send them my way. Anyway, just thought I'd get in that plug.
I just ask, do you think it's so difficult? Because on one level, I mean, I've spoken at state schools where you go in and there's clearly the first and only job really is to maintain discipline. Chaos in the corridors, you know, very different from your situation at Michaela. But why would anyone not want to say, hold on a minute, this isn't working for us? Why would anyone resist any of this? Why would anyone say, we can't, you know, this is perfect the way it is, because it clearly isn't when you go into schools like that. I mean, it strikes me that the problem is that this is like a broader, bigger, deeper sociological problem that we have that has seen the breakdown of family values, that has seen, obviously, rise in, as you talked about, you know, children looking at porn until 3 a.m., you know, the advent of social media and mobile phones being used all the time. I mean, this is a giant issue, isn't it? Because this is the only explanation I can think of that, you know, apart from people wanting to not admit they're wrong. But, you know, you go into these schools, you think, why would you not want to have a complete revolution here? Because it's failing.
Yes. So you're absolutely right. It is a much bigger issue, and the family situation and so on, absolutely. The question is whether or not schools could do more given the magnitude of the situation outside. And of course, that also needs addressing. I'm just talking about schools in this moment. And I think schools can do more. And then you ask why. And of course, I mean, I sort of was referring to that in my talk, which is that people feel like it's mean. So it's two things. They feel like it's mean, and it's also really hard to do. I meet with my senior team every morning at 7 a.m. My teachers work really hard. I'm constantly thinking about, I mean, I'm here today, but, you know, just before I came in, I'm on my phone, dealing with things at school, texting about X, Y, and Z. You know, I am constantly on it. It's hard to get consistency across a school amongst your staff. But it's also the case that people naturally reject. So, for instance, our silent corridors. It feels mean. Why would you want them to be silent? Why wouldn't you want them chatting? And my position is always, look, They are not skipping through the corridors chatting about Aristotle. That is not what's going on. They are pushing each other and shoving each other and punching each other and doing all sorts of craziness. And actually, if you can just keep them quiet for a minute and a half and move very quickly in single file, it means you get more time with them in the lessons. It means that your 11-year-olds who actually have a chronological reading age of a 7-year-old will be able to catch up because you have more time with them. And all it takes is for the teachers to be in the corridors and for a culture of silence to be there. And then the kids are just silent. You know, like it's no big deal. People imagine that I'm marching up down the corridors with whips and chains and I'm all kind of, the kids just move really quickly to the lessons and then they get on with it. But it makes people feel very awkward. It especially makes them awkward. For instance, you give a little year 7 a detention for not having his equipment. So our kids know if you don't have your equipment, and there's very specific what equipment they need, if they don't have their pen, for instance, they will get a detention. And you think, oh gosh, little 11-year-old, you know, they've got a detention, poor little thing. And right now, just in September, even I'll look at the little year 7s queuing up for detention, and I think, oh, poor little year 7s. And it is, because they're so cute. But the thing is, they're just the most adorable things. But what I know happens is that in that first 2 weeks, you see the queue of year 7s, and it starts to dwindle slowly, until no one gets any more detentions for equipment. And what have we done? We've taught an entire year group at 11 years old how to be prepared, how to check your equipment the night before, how to put it in your bag and care about the details, how to make sure that day after day for the next 5 years you're going to come into school with the right stuff. How is that a bad thing? Yes, at the beginning they've got their detentions. And yes, I look at them and go, poor little year 7s. But I hold back. I don't allow that sense of compassion in me at that point to go, it's all right, little year 7s, go home, don't go into detention. People find that difficult, you see? They find it difficult. And my position is, if you really love the child, that's when you hold the line. You need to love them enough to hold the line. It is much easier to say, oh, go on, just go on social media, go on, go to the party, do whatever you want. Much easier to just let them get away with whatever they want. Any parent knows this. Any parent knows how hard it is to hold the line. And yet, when I talk about these things, I'm vilified, and, you know, they call me far right. That's what they say. They say I'm far right. Is there anything that I said here today that's far right? It's the most insane thing I've ever heard. But the thing is that the left have abandoned all these values. Once upon a time, the left owned these values. Like, it's crazy. Well, this stuff should be so normal for all of us. All of us should know it. But the problem is, it's just what you said about families. Parents themselves have abandoned these values. Parents themselves don't know how to raise their children. Parents want to be friends with their kids instead of holding them to account and understanding that what you want from a child is admiration and respect. You do not want friendship. That is wrong. It is to misunderstand your role as an adult with them. We are meant to lead them. They are meant to follow. And then once they've been following for that time, that's how they then become leaders. That's how it works. You don't just throw them in the deep end and say, go to it. They're kids. I mean, and this is the thing. We understand that when they're 5. I always say, this is the thing, when it comes to secondary schools. You know, people say, oh, let the child decide what secondary school they're going to. When they were 5 and you were thinking about their primary school, you didn't let them choose what primary school they were going to. So why on earth would you let a 10-year-old decide what secondary school they're going to? They are children. And so this is the thing that I keep saying to my families when they come. You know, I give them talks about what they should be doing at home and so on, and they're always so grateful. They really are. Because the thing is, our whole culture, our whole society now is opposing of these values that I'm talking about. So for any head teacher to stand and do what I'm doing, they have to fight the world. And most people are not willing to fight everybody. Most people have a mortgage to pay, have a family to raise. They just want to be normal. They want to go to their job and be normal. They do not want to be on Twitter fighting with lunatics all the time, which is what I seem to be doing.
Yet, however, it doesn't seem to be a good investment if if you spend that little amount of time making sure that discipline is something that comes naturally to the child later, you avoid the classroom chaos. I seem to remember that the teachers that everyone ended up liking were, in fact, the strictest. They were the ones having very explicit rules. This is what you're supposed to do. This is when I expect your homework. This is what I want you to do as a pupil. And the ones who were very lenient and very mild at the beginning of the year, it ended up being chaos at the second session, and then no one was really paying attention to what was going on in the classroom. And I think that encourages a lot of, well, classroom chaos where no one is engaging anymore. You were telling in the documentary about escalation of discipline matters. So would you say that there is a problem with the way adults see authority, especially when it comes to dealing with ethnic minority children, as though because this kid is slightly more tan than the average, anything goes, and he will not be taken accountable, or because this girl comes from a complicated background, I will not hold her accountable. How do you see the connection we have to authority with regards to children?
Yeah, so we mix up what it is to be in authority with being authoritarian. We don't understand the distinction. So being in authority now makes us feel like we're Hitler, and that is not the case. Being authoritarian is to control, and being in authority is to lead. It's a different thing. Authority is bound up with love. So when you come to Michaela, you feel the love in every classroom. The teachers, my teachers, they just love the kids. And the kids know that they are loved. You got to remember that there's 750 or whatever of them, and there's 70 odd of us. So there's no way that we would be keeping them in line just by being bouncers and being mean and on top of them. They buy into the system. Your detentions and so on are keeping in your 15% on the outskirts. The vast majority are buying into the system, and then every now and again they fall into the detention lot, and then they come back out. They understand. We talk about being top of the pyramid. And you want to climb the pyramid. And at the bottom of the pyramid, we say you do the right thing at the bottom because you want to avoid a detention or a demerit. Then you move up, you want a merit. Then you move up because you want to impress your teachers. You understand you're going to have a future. And at the top, it's just who you are. And so you're moving from being motivated just because you're trying to avoid a detention until eventually, like I said about the year 7s, at first they're doing it, oh, got to make sure I do my equipment, otherwise I'll get a detention. Oh, got to make sure, I want to impress my form tutor, so I'm going to make sure, and then a bit further up. And then eventually, they're just bringing in their equipment because they are just the kind of person who checks their stuff in the evening before. They always turn up on time. They are just that kind of person. And that's what happens to our kids. That's what every child growing up anywhere, they are learning habits. And the problem with children who are in chaotic environments, which unfortunately is far too many in the country, is that the chaos of that environment becomes what their habit is. And they are then just learning things like, how do I get through the corridor and not get hit? How do I get away from the bullies over there? How do I avoid this, and so on? It's just a sad state of affairs. But it requires a different kind of mindset. And it requires all of us as a society. That's the thing. It's not just about the head teachers. It really isn't, because we're asking too much of them in many ways. And there are some who are doing it and who are very brave. But all of us in society need to be embracing of these values and talking about them more. And too many of us are scared to do it, I think, which is what we were saying before, you know? Too many of us are frightened about what will happen, losing our friends, saying what's right. But doing what's right and what's true is always hard. It's always been hard, and all of us need to do it.
I want to just, because I know we're running out of time, I want to thank you for everything that you are doing, Katharine, because it's people use the word inspiring very frequently and, you know, without really meaning it often, but you are genuinely inspiring, and we all look forward, I'm sure, to hearing or seeing what happens next. That's the bit we haven't asked yet, isn't it? Oh, I think a gentleman wants to ask a question. Is that allowed? No, we've gone far too far, have we? Okay. Oh, I don't know, afterwards then. But I just want to thank you, and thank you for challenging us all to remind us to have the courage to speak out as well.
Thank you. Thanks very much for having me.